What is consciousness? It seems like a simple question. You're conscious right now. You're experiencing this moment, having thoughts, seeing colors, feeling emotions. Consciousness is the most obvious, immediate thing in your existence. It's what makes you you. So defining it should be easy, right? Wrong. Consciousness might be the hardest thing in the universe to define. Philosophers have tried for millennia. Neuroscientists scan brains looking for it. Psychologists study its properties. AI researchers try to create it. And despite all this effort, we still can't agree on what consciousness actually is. Some call it the hard problem of consciousness, explaining how subjective experience arises from physical matter. But what if the problem isn't that consciousness is hard to define? What if the problem is the way we're asking the question? Enter Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher who revolutionized how we think about language and meaning. In his later work, especially Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein didn't try to answer philosophical questions. He tried to show that many philosophical questions are confused from the start, based on misunderstandings about how language actually works. And consciousness might be the perfect example of a philosophical pseudo-problem, a question that seems profound but is actually just linguistic confusion dressed up as mystery. Here's Wittgenstein's radical insight. When we ask, what is consciousness? We're assuming consciousness is a thing with an essence that can be defined. We're treating it like we treat water or gold, substances with definite properties we can discover. But what if consciousness isn't that kind of word? What if it works differently in language, and our confusion comes from trying to pin down a single definition when the word has multiple, context-dependent uses? Think about how many different things we mean by consciousness. Sometimes we mean being awake versus asleep or unconscious. Sometimes we mean subjective experience, what it's like to see red or taste chocolate. Sometimes we mean self-awareness, knowing that you exist and have mental states. Sometimes we mean attention, being conscious of something specific. Sometimes we mean moral awareness, having a conscience, being conscious of right and wrong. These are all different meanings, different language games, but we use the same word for all of them. When philosophers ask, what is consciousness? They're usually trying to find one essential definition that captures all these uses. But Wittgenstein would say this is a mistake. There might not be one thing that all uses of consciousness share. Instead, the word might have what he called family resemblances, overlapping similarities without a common core. Just like games share various features without having one essential property that makes something a game, consciousness might be a family resemblance concept. This isn't just semantic nitpicking. It changes everything. If we're looking for the essence of consciousness and there is no single essence, we're on a wild goose chase. We're asking a question that has no answer because the question itself is malformed. It's like asking what is the essence of game? Or what does red really mean? These questions feel profound, but they're based on confused assumptions about how language works. Wittgenstein's approach was therapeutic. He didn't want to solve philosophical problems by giving better answers. He wanted to dissolve them by showing how the problems arise from linguistic confusion. When we're tangled up in a philosophical puzzle, we need to look at how we're using words, what language games we're playing, and whether we've accidentally taken words out of their normal contexts and pushed them into strange territory where they no longer make sense. So when neuroscientists look for the neural correlates of consciousness, when philosophers debate whether consciousness is physical or non-physical, when AI researchers try to determine if machines can be conscious, they might all be trapped in the same confusion. They're treating consciousness as if it's one definite thing that exists somewhere, waiting to be discovered and defined. But what if it's not? What if consciousness is more like game or good, a word we use in many different ways for many different purposes, and the search for its single essence is doomed from the start? This doesn't mean consciousness doesn't exist or that we can't study the mind. It means we need to be much more careful about what questions we're asking and whether those questions actually make sense. Instead of asking what is consciousness, we might need to ask, how do we use the word consciousness in different contexts? What we doing with this word? What language games is it part of? Wittgenstein once wrote, philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. We're bewitched by consciousness. The word feels so important, so fundamental, that we think there must be some deep truth it refers to. But maybe the bewitchment is the problem. Maybe the reason we can't define consciousness isn't that it's mysteriously complex, but that we're asking the wrong kind of question. Over the next parts, we'll explore how Wittgenstein's approach transforms our understanding of consciousness. We'll look at why traditional definitions fail, how the heart problem might be a linguistic confusion, why the mind-body problem looks different through Wittgenstein's lens, and what we should actually be asking instead of what is consciousness? get ready to have your assumptions challenged. Because if Wittgenstein is right, the consciousness problem isn't a problem to solve, it's a confusion to untangle. Why every definition fails and why that matters. Let's try to define consciousness. Go ahead, take a moment. How would you explain what consciousness is to someone who somehow didn't know? You'll probably say something like, consciousness is subjective experience, or, it's what it's like to be you, or, it's awareness of yourself and your surroundings, or, it's the feeling of being alive and having thoughts. All of these sound reasonable, but they all fail. And they fail in instructive ways that reveal exactly what Wittgenstein was getting at. Let's see why. Consciousness is subjective experience. Okay, but what's experience? If you're defining consciousness as experience, you're just swapping one mysterious word for another. And what makes experience subjective rather than objective? You're assuming we all know what subjective means, but that's just as unclear as consciousness itself. You haven't defined consciousness. You've just given us more undefined terms. It's what it's like to be you. This is a famous formulation from philosopher Thomas Nagel. But what does what it's like mean? When we say there's something it's like to be a bat or to see red, we're using a metaphorical expression. But consciousness isn't literally like anything else. The phrase what it's like is trying to point at something we can't quite express, which suggests we don't really have a clear concept of what we're talking about. It's awareness of yourself and your surroundings. But now we've defined consciousness in terms of awareness, which is just another word for consciousness. We're going in circles. And are you always aware of yourself? Right now, before I mentioned it, were you aware of your left foot? Were you unconscious of your foot? Or is consciousness somehow present even when you're not paying attention to something? It's the feeling of being alive and having thoughts. But plants are alive and not conscious. Computers process information and aren't conscious. So being alive isn't sufficient. And do you feel your thoughts? When you think 2 + 2 is equal to 4, is there a feeling accompanying that thought? Or are we confusing consciousness with emotion? Here's what's happening. Every time we try to define consciousness, we either use equally mysterious terms, experience, awareness, subjectivity, or we describe specific features that don't capture everything we mean by consciousness, or we end up in circular definitions. This suggests something's wrong with the project itself. Wittgenstein would say we're making a classic philosophical mistake. We're treating consciousness as if it's an object or substance that we can examine and describe, when actually it's a complex term we use in many different ways in many different contexts. The word doesn't have a precise definition in the way water is H2O has a definition. It has uses, and these uses overlap and vary. Consider how we actually use consciousness in ordinary language. She regained consciousness after the accident. Here consciousness means being awake and responsive. He was conscious of being watched. Here it means noticing or being aware of something specific. They have no social consciousness. Here it means moral or political awareness. The stream of consciousness technique in literature. Here it means the flow of thoughts and perceptions. Animal consciousness. Here we're asking what mental life animals have. These are all legitimate uses, but they don't all point to one underlying thing. Wittgenstein's concept of family resemblance is crucial here. Think about the word game. Chess, football, solitaire, ring around the rosy, all are games, but there's no single feature they all share. Some are competitive, some aren't. Some require skill, some are pure luck. Some have teams, some are solitary. They form a family where members share various features with various other members, but there's no essential core that makes something a game. Consciousness might be the same. Different uses share overlapping features without having one essence. This is why the hard problem of consciousness might be hard for the wrong reasons. The hard problem, formulated by philosopher David Chalmers, asks, how does subjective experience arise from physical processes? How does brain activity produce the feeling of what it's like to see red or taste coffee? But notice what this assumes, that there's one definite thing called subjective experience, or what it's like-ness, that needs explaining. But what if there isn't? What if we're bundling together many different phenomena under one word and then puzzling over what unifies them? Wittgenstein wrote, "A picture held us captive. And we could not get outside it, for it lay in our language, and language seemed to repeat it to us inexorably." The picture holding us captive with consciousness is this. Consciousness is a special inner substance or property, private and immaterial, that somehow inhabits our brains and gives us subjective experience. This picture comes from our language, from how we talk about inner mental states versus outer physical states. But the picture might be wrong. Think about pain. We say pain is in your head or your hand. But pain isn't literally a thing inside you the way blood is inside you. Pain is something you feel, an experience you have, a response to tissue damage. When we ask, what is pain? We run into the same problems as with consciousness. Every definition either uses equally mysterious terms or describes features that don't capture everything we mean. But in ordinary life, we have no trouble using the word pain. Children learn it. Doctors diagnose it. We communicate about it successfully. The philosophical confusion arises when we take the word out of its ordinary contexts and ask abstract questions about its essence. Here's the therapeutic move Wittgenstein would make. Instead of asking what is consciousness, and expecting a philosophical definition, look at how we actually use the word in various contexts. What are we doing when we say someone is conscious or unconscious? What job is the word performing? In medical contexts, it distinguishes patients who respond to stimuli from those who don't. In philosophical contexts, it marks the difference between entities we think have subjective experiences and those we think don't. In everyday contexts, it means paying attention to something or being aware of it. These are all legitimate uses, and they don't need to be unified by one underlying essence. The failure of every definition isn't a sign that consciousness is mysteriously complex. It's a sign that we're asking the wrong kind of question. We're trying to find an essence where there might not be one. We're trying to give a philosophical definition for a term that works perfectly well in ordinary language without needing such a definition. And this confusion, this bewitchment by language, is what creates the apparently insoluble problems of consciousness that philosophers have wrestled with for centuries. The private language problem, or why your mind isn't private. Here's where things get really weird. Most people assume their consciousness is fundamentally private. Nobody can access your subjective experience. Nobody knows what it's like to be you. Your thoughts, feelings, and experiences are locked inside your head, inaccessible to others. This seems obviously true. But Wittgenstein's private language argument suggests this picture is deeply confused, and recognizing this confusion transforms how we think about consciousness. The private language argument goes like this. Imagine you want to create a private language to name your private sensations. You have a particular sensation, call it S, and you decide to mark its occurrence in a diary. Only you can know what S refers to because only you have access to this private sensation. Now the question is, does this make sense? Can you actually create a meaningful private language for private experiences? Wittgenstein argues no. Here's why. For S to be a meaningful word, there must be a difference between using it correctly and using it incorrectly. If you write S when you have a certain sensation, you need to be able to distinguish having that same sensation again from having a different sensation. But how do you check? You might think, I remember what S feels like, but memory can be wrong. The problem is that you have no independent criterion for correctness. Whatever seems right to you is right, and that means there's no real distinction between correct and incorrect usage. And if there's no such distinction, S isn't meaningful at all. In public language, we have criteria for correct usage. If you call a green thing red, others can correct you. There are public standards for what counts as red. But with a purely private sensation that only you can experience, there's no such standard. You're trying to use your own impression of correctness as the standard, but that's like trying to check whether today's newspaper is accurate by buying another copy of the same newspaper. You need an independent check, and with private sensations, none exists. This doesn't mean you don't have sensations or experiences. It means the language we use to talk about sensations and experiences can't be purely private. The words pain, red, happy get their meaning from public language games, not from private mental acts of naming inner objects. When a child learns the word pain, they don't introspect and attach a word to a private sensation. They learn the word in a public context where adults respond to their pain behavior with the word pain, teaching them how to use the word in our shared language. Think about what this means for consciousness. If the language we use to describe consciousness is public, then consciousness isn't purely private in the way we typically assume. Yes, you have experiences only you have. But the concepts you use to understand and describe those experiences come from public language. The very idea of subjective experience, or what it's like, is a public concept, not something you could have invented in isolation. Wittgenstein writes, the essential thing about private experience is really not that each person possesses his own exemplar, but that nobody knows whether other people also have this or something else. The assumption would thus be possible, though unverifiable, that one section of mankind had one sensation of red and another section another. But notice what he's pointing out. We can't even formulate the question coherently without using public language that already presupposes shared meanings. This has radical implications. The mind-body problem, for instance, assumes a sharp distinction between private mental states and public physical states. Descartes said mental states are known with certainty through introspection while physical states are known through observation. But if mental concepts are public concepts learned in public contexts, this picture collapses. Your access to your own mental states isn't fundamentally different in kind from your access to physical states. You don't have some special private mental sense that gives you infallible knowledge of your consciousness. Consider the concept of knowing your own mind. We say you have privileged access to your own thoughts and feelings. You know them directly while others must infer them from your behavior. But this privileged access isn't what Descartes thought it was. You can be wrong about your own mental states. You can think you're angry when you're actually hurt. You can think you believe something when your behavior shows you don't. Psychotherapy often involves discovering that what you thought you felt or believed isn't quite right. If mental states were purely private objects of introspection, this wouldn't be possible. What's actually happening is this. You learn psychological concepts in public contexts and then apply them to yourself using the same criteria you use for others, plus some additional information about your circumstances and behavioral inclinations. You don't read your own mind in some special way. You interpret yourself using public concepts, and you can be wrong in these interpretations just like others can be wrong about you. This doesn't mean there's no difference between first-person and third-person perspectives. Obviously, you have experiences others don't have. But the difference isn't that you have special access to private mental objects. The difference is that you're differently positioned, you have different information, different causal relations to your own behavior, different social roles in talking about yourself versus talking about others. Wittgenstein's point is that philosophical problems about consciousness often arise from taking public concepts out of their normal contexts and pushing them into strange territory. We take words like experience, feeling, awareness, words that work perfectly well in ordinary contexts. And we ask, but what do they really refer to? What is the inner thing they name? And we end up confused because we're treating words as if they name private mental objects when actually they're part of public language games with complex rules and uses. The private language argument shows that meaning can't be grounded in private mental acts. It must be grounded in public practices, shared forms of life. And if this is true for meaning, it's true for consciousness talk. The concepts we use to think about consciousness, experience, awareness, subjectivity, qualia, aren't labels for private mental stuff. They're tools in public language games, and understanding consciousness requires understanding how these language games work, not trying to peer into some inner mental realm. This is deeply unsettling for many people. It seems to deny the specialness, the privacy, the intimacy of consciousness. But Wittgenstein isn't denying your experiences. He's showing that the way we philosophically conceptualize those experiences is confused. The picture of consciousness as a private inner theater where subjective experiences happen is the picture holding us captive. And it's this picture that creates the apparently insoluble problems. How can we know other minds exist? How does consciousness emerge from matter? What is the nature of subjective experience? These problems seem deep, but they might just be artifacts of confused philosophical pictures embedded in our language. What scientists are actually studying and why it's not consciousness. So if the philosophical concept of consciousness is confused, what are neuroscientists actually studying when they study consciousness? What are they measuring in their experiments? This question reveals something important. Scientists aren't really studying consciousness in the grand philosophical sense. They're studying specific, measurable phenomena that we sometimes describe using consciousness vocabulary. Consider the neuroscience of consciousness. Researchers might study the neural correlates of being awake versus asleep. They identify brain patterns associated with responsiveness to stimuli. They investigate what happens during anesthesia when patients become unconscious. They explore how attention works, how we become aware of specific stimuli, how we integrate information across brain regions. These are all legitimate, answerable questions. But notice, none of them are really about consciousness in the deep philosophical sense. They're about specific cognitive and neurological processes. Wittgenstein would say these scientists are playing different language games than philosophers. When a neuroscientist says consciousness, they often mean something like integrated information processing, or global workspace activation, or brain states associated with reportability. These are operationalized definitions, definitions that specify measurable criteria. They're not trying to capture the essence of subjective experience. They're defining terms in ways that allow empirical investigation. This is perfectly fine for science. Science doesn't need to solve philosophical problems about the nature of consciousness. It needs to ask specific, testable questions. But confusion arises when we think scientific studies of brain processes are explaining consciousness in the grand philosophical sense. They're not. They're explaining specific phenomena that philosophers and ordinary people sometimes refer to using consciousness vocabulary. Take the famous question, are animals conscious? Scientifically, this breaks down into many specific questions. Can animals feel pain? This becomes, do they have nociceptors? Do they exhibit pain behaviors? Do they learn to avoid harmful stimuli? Can they experience emotions? This becomes, do they have brain structures associated with emotions? Do they exhibit behavioral markers of emotional states? These are answerable questions. But asking, are animals conscious? In the grand philosophical sense, do they have subjective experience? Is there something it's like to be them? Is much harder because we're not clear what we're asking. Wittgenstein's approach helps us see why. Consciousness in ordinary language games works fine. We can say the dog is conscious, meaning the dog is awake and responsive. We can say the dog isn't conscious of the trick, meaning the dog doesn't notice it. But when philosophers ask, does the dog have consciousness in the sense of subjective experience? We've taken the word out of context where it has clear use and pushed it into territory where it's unclear what criteria would settle the question. The same issue appears with artificial intelligence. Will AI ever be conscious? This seems like a profound question, but Wittgenstein would ask, what would count as an answer? If we build a robot that behaves exactly like a human, reports having experiences, passes every test we give it, would we say it's conscious? If yes, then consciousness is really about behavior and functional organization, not some mysterious inner property. If no, then what more are we demanding? Some non-functional, non-behavioral property? But then how would we ever know it exists? This is Wittgenstein's point about criteria. In ordinary language games, we have criteria for applying terms. We know what counts as someone being conscious or unconscious in a medical context. We know what counts as being conscious of something. But philosophical uses of consciousness strip away these criteria and leave us with a term that doesn't have clear application conditions. Then we puzzle over what consciousness really is, not recognizing that the puzzle is self-created. Consider studies of neural correlates of consciousness. Researchers identify brain activity associated with conscious perception versus unconscious processing. For instance, when visual stimuli are presented too briefly to be consciously perceived, they still affect behavior and show certain brain activity. When they're presented long enough to be consciously perceived, different patterns emerge. This is fascinating neuroscience. But what's it really showing? It's showing differences between conditions where subjects report seeing something versus not reporting seeing it, or between conditions where stimuli affect explicit versus implicit processing. These are objective, measurable differences. But calling one conscious and the other unconscious is importing philosophical vocabulary into scientific contexts. The science doesn't depend on solving philosophical problems about consciousness. It depends on identifying specific functional and neural differences. Wittgenstein wrote, "We must do away with all explanation, and description alone must take its place." He meant that philosophy shouldn't try to explain phenomena by positing hidden essences or mechanisms. It should describe how language actually works in various contexts. Applied to consciousness, instead of trying to explain what consciousness really is, we should describe how consciousness talk works in different contexts. Medical, scientific, philosophical, everyday. In medical contexts, consciousness is a spectrum from coma to full alertness, measured by responsiveness. In scientific contexts, it's often operationalized as specific cognitive functions like attention, integration, reportability. In philosophical contexts, it's treated as subjective experience, qualia, what it's likeness. In everyday contexts, it means being awake, noticing things, being aware. These are all legitimate uses, but they're different language games with different rules and purposes. The mistake is thinking there must be one underlying phenomenon that all these uses refer to. Neuroscientists might discover everything about brain processes associated with wakefulness, attention, perception, integration, and reportability. They might map every neural correlate perfectly. But philosophers could still ask, yes, but what about subjective experience itself? What about qualia? What about what it's likeness? And this question might not be a question about something science hasn't discovered yet. It might be a confused question, asking for something that doesn't exist because it's based on a misunderstanding of how consciousness talk works. This doesn't mean consciousness is an illusion or that subjective experience doesn't exist. It means the philosophical picture of consciousness as one unified mysterious property that needs explaining is confused. What exists are various phenomena, being awake, paying attention, having sensations, thinking, feeling, perceiving, that we describe using consciousness vocabulary in different contexts for different purposes. Science can study these phenomena, but it can't solve the philosophical problem of consciousness because the philosophical problem isn't really a problem. It's a confusion generated by taking ordinary language out of its working contexts and demanding it do something it was never designed to do. So what should we ask instead? If "what is consciousness?" is the wrong question, what's the right question? Or is there even a right question? Wittgenstein's approach suggests we need to completely reorient how we think about consciousness. Instead of seeking definitions and essences, we should examine uses and contexts. Instead of asking metaphysical questions, we should look at grammatical ones. How does consciousness talk function in our language? First, stop looking for the essence. If consciousness is a family resemblance concept, there's no single feature that all users share. Accept that we use consciousness in different ways for different purposes, and that's fine. We don't need a unified theory of consciousness any more than we need a unified theory of games. We can understand how the word works without finding its essence. Second, investigate language games. When doctors assess consciousness in patients, what criteria do they use? Responsiveness, eye-opening, verbal communication, purposeful movement. These are behavioral criteria embedded in medical practice. When philosophers discuss phenomenal consciousness, they're usually asking about whether there's something it's like to have certain experiences. This is a different language game with different rules. Understanding consciousness means understanding these different games and how they relate. Third, resist the urge to make everything into a philosophical mystery. Yes, we don't fully understand how brains produce behavior and cognition. Yes, there's much neuroscience left to discover. But the philosophical problem of consciousness, the hard problem, the explanatory gap, the puzzle of subjective experience, might not be a real problem requiring a solution. It might be confusion requiring dissolution. Think about parallel cases. Philosophers once puzzled over, what is life? They assumed life was some special vital force that animated living things. Biology showed this was wrong. Living things are complex physical systems with certain organizational properties. There's no vital force, no special life essence. Once we understood the mechanisms, metabolism, reproduction, homeostasis, the mystery dissolved. Not because we found the essence of life, but because we realized we were asking the wrong question. Consciousness might be similar. We assume consciousness is one special thing that needs explaining. But maybe there's no unified phenomenon corresponding to philosophical consciousness. There are just various cognitive and neural processes, attention, integration, memory, perception, self-monitoring, that we bundle together under one term. Understanding these processes won't solve the philosophical problem because the philosophical problem is confused, not deep. Wittgenstein wrote, "The real discovery is the one that gives philosophy peace, so that it is no longer tormented by questions which bring itself in question." Applied to consciousness, the real insight isn't a theory explaining what consciousness is. It's recognizing that the question, "What is consciousness?" brings itself into question. It's not a well-formed question requiring an answer but a confused question requiring clarification. So what should philosophers and scientists do? For science, keep investigating specific phenomena. Neural correlates of attention, mechanisms of sensory integration, brain states associated with anesthesia, cognitive differences between species. These are answerable questions. Just don't think you're solving the philosophical problem of consciousness because that problem is confused. For philosophy, the task is therapeutic. Help people see why they're confused about consciousness. Show how philosophical pictures embedded in language create apparent mysteries. Demonstrate that ordinary consciousness talk works fine without grand theories about the nature of subjective experience. Bring words back from their metaphysical usage to their everyday usage where things are clear. Does this mean consciousness isn't special or important? No. Your experiences matter enormously to you. The fact that you're conscious in the sense of being awake, aware, and experiencing is what makes life meaningful. But recognizing that these experiences exist doesn't require buying into confused philosophical pictures about the nature of consciousness. You can have rich subjective experiences while rejecting the notion that subjective experience names some mysterious inner substance. Here's what changes if you accept Wittgenstein's approach. You stop waiting for neuroscience to somehow explain how consciousness emerges from matter because you recognize this isn't the right expectation. You stop puzzling over whether other people or animals or AI really have subjective experiences because you recognize these questions lack clear criteria for answers. You stop treating consciousness as a deep metaphysical mystery and start seeing it as a perfectly ordinary aspect of life described using ordinary language that only seems mysterious when we philosophize badly about it. This is unsatisfying for many people. We want grand theories. We want profound answers to deep questions. Wittgenstein offers neither. He offers clarification, the dissolution of confusion, the recognition that many philosophical problems aren't problems at all. This feels deflationary. But it's also liberating. You're freed from impossible questions. You can stop waiting for philosophy or science to finally explain the nature of consciousness because you recognize there's no single nature to explain. What remains is the hard work of understanding how consciousness talk actually works in various contexts, how different disciplines and practices use consciousness vocabulary for different purposes, and why philosophical abstraction from these contexts creates confusion. This is less glamorous than solving the hard problem of consciousness, but it's actually achievable and actually clarifying. So here's the final answer. What is consciousness? It's a word we use in various language games for various purposes, and there's no single essence unifying all uses. When you ask what it really is, you're asking a confused question based on misunderstanding how language works. The better question isn't what is consciousness? But how does consciousness talk function in different contexts, and why does philosophical reflection on it generate confusion? Not as satisfying as a grand theory, but probably closer to the truth, and definitely better than spending centuries puzzling over a question that has no answer because it's not really a question at all. Welcome to Wittgensteinian therapy. The treatment is recognizing the question is the disease, and the cure is understanding how language bewitches us into thinking there's a deep mystery where there's really just linguistic confusion. Consciousness exists. Your experiences are real. But consciousness the philosophical problem? That's just what happens when we let language go on holiday and forget to bring it back to work.